Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Oh, the little mic seems a bit hot. Let me turn that down just a little bit. Uh, Welcome to class today, everybody. Good afternoon to you. I hope you all enjoyed your week off for fall break there this past week. I hope you all get to have a little bit of rest, a little bit of kind of catch up time maybe for yourselves, just so we can go ahead and get to finishing the semester strong, because that's really going to be the next thing, right? We've got about 6-7 weeks left in the semester, right? So we are, entering the downhill slope here, and we'll be finishing the semester before you know it. Before I talk about the material that I want to cover today, I do have just that one brief announcement, which is the one you've heard me say a bunch of times. I'm just going to keep on reiterating it. I'm sorry, right? And that's that our IT advising day is this coming Tuesday, 10 o'clock a.m. to 11 o'clock a.m. in Paxway Room 3200 here on campus. If you're able to attend, I know some of you work, I know some of you have other obligations, that's fine. If you're able to attend, it'd be great if you would come by. We're going to have, members of the advising staff there, all the IT instructors will be there. Just helping you kind of get squared away so you know what to take in the spring, or you're ready to graduate. That's definitely one thing that we don't want to happen is, you think you're taking everything you need for spring, and you're going to graduate on time and everything's going to be great, and then something you forgot about, something you weren't aware of, just steps right out and smacks you in the face, and that's no fun, right? Like that's not something that we want. So if you're unable to come, please contact me, and I'll make sure you get what you need, right? You have an understanding of what we'll take. As we've been doing the past few semesters, the options for spring will also be offered both seated and online, and we'll do the one that has more students in it. So that'll be coming out soon. Registration will be opening up real soon. All this, to my knowledge, all the schedules have been submitted. They just have to kind of push everything out to you all. So I'd be looking for that within the next couple of weeks here, just so you can get ready for spring. Also, just another quick announcement, like even though you guys had fall break last week, I didn't. And they had me in a lot of meetings and stuff last week. I am a little bit behind on grading and stuff. I don't remember how far behind or if I'm behind in this class or not. So just bear with me if you're waiting on something to get graded that hasn't been graded yet. My plan is to get that graded by the end of the week, this week. I don't like being behind either, but it happens sometimes, right? So just bear with me a little bit there. But with that being said, we are talking C.R.A.P this week. And these are our general rules for design. And I think it's, we're in this phase, right, where up until this point, we've been talking a lot about discovery, right? We've been talking a lot about research. And now, since really starting with our last live stream, which was, last time, week 4 last, when we talked about color, right? We're starting to move into this other realm, this sort of development realm, right? Like we're moving through this process of design from discovery through creation, and then eventually we'll move into testing. And we'll have all these different understandings of kind of what we're working with in our design process. So we're in this phase now where we're doing more development and we're doing more building, and we're trying to figure out how things should look. What colors should we use? How can we develop a color theme? And how can we lay out our information on a page? And so really when it comes to this content here, that's kind of at the core of what's important there, is how we lay our content out. So we are talking C.R.A.P. And, when you hear that term, right, it might bring up certain connotations, right? Like, I know what you're probably thinking, but that's not it. Although I think all of you, like I've already read through a lot of the stuff in the module, you already know what this is. So maybe you're thinking exactly, maybe it's exactly what you think because you've already read through the material in the module. But it's probably, maybe it's not what you're thinking, right? Because there are several different meanings of the word that is formed by this acronym. But what we're talking about here, for our purposes, are these underlying principles that govern the most important aspects of great design. And so when we're talking C.R.A.P, we're talking about an acronym, C.R.A.P. And this stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And as we go through our material today, I'd like to just kind of take a few minutes and look at each of these different elements of design. And then we can also, along the way, I'm going to show you just a couple little samples that can kind of help make sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about these principles. And the first one is contrast. So contrast is a super big deal, and we use contrast a lot. And we see like different types of examples of different types of contrast. Right? And when we're trying to organize data and we're trying to make certain things be more important than other things, and we try to set things apart from one another visually, contrast is a big thing that we use. So when we're looking at contrast, we have a little quote here about contrast. Contrast is the difference in visual properties that makes an object distinguishable from other objects around it. So this is sort of our functional definition of what contrast is. Right? So we're trying to look at the visual differences that makes one thing different from another thing. And we can see this like in real life applications as well, right? Like remember that one of the big things that we talk about in this course is how we can kind of take these real life applications and apply them to the web, right? So like if you think about, say, your remote control, right, that you use to control your television. Well, typically on a lot of television remotes, you'll see that the power button is a different color than the rest of the buttons. Right? Or maybe it's a different size than the rest of the buttons. The power button stands out in some way and makes it visually different than the rest of the elements. Let's just... I wasn't intending to do this, but let's just pull up a picture here just so we can kind of see this visually. We'll just grab a little picture. But we can see a great example of that here, right? We have this television remote control here. And as you'll notice, the power button exhibits a lot of contrast. Right? We have our power button here in the upper left-hand corner of the remote. And we can see that not only is it a different color, but it's a different shape from the rest of the buttons. So we're using this in this instance to call attention to this element. Right? We're using this contrast to make this power button stand out and stand apart from the rest of the buttons on the remote. This gives you that visual difference that we're looking for there, which is super significant. Like you can see the other buttons around it, how they all kind of look similar and how they're all kind of grouped together, right? And we have elements of repetition and proximity there. But that power button's important, and that power button is different, so we make it stand out a little bit more by giving it contrast. And so we use this contrast as kind of these ups and downs for us to gain attention, right? Like I have the picture of the roller coaster here. Right? Like by having something that really stands out, we can set it apart from everything else. And so we can kind of take people on a journey with us, and we can take them. And this is one of those places where we can do these things like we can kind of manipulate the way that people kind of move around our sites. And we can manipulate the way that we gain people's attention and we move people across the page. Right? Because if we want people to start in a certain place that might be a little off base from where one would normally start, maybe reading something or interacting with something, well, we can take that one element that we want to draw attention to and make it look incredibly different than anything else on the page. And this is our contrast. Because if we take that and we make it look incredibly different, it's going to stand out. Like you might have seen like the picture of like something different in a flock of sheep. Right? Like you have this flock of sheep, every sheep looks similar, but then you have like, I don't know, a dog, like a black dog that's in the middle of all the sheep. And it stands out. It sticks out like a sore thumb, right? And so we do that same sort of thing with contrast in our web design to gain people's attention and be able to move them kind of where we want them to go. So when we're achieving contrast, what we want to do is we want to make an environment in which contrast would happen. So we take things that are alike, things that are the same, and we put them together. And that's, going to liken us more to our rules of proximity and alignment and repetition, which we'll also talk about. Right? But if we take things that are similar and we put the similar things together and we make them look similar, and then we take different things and make them pop, make them stand out, make them a different color, make them a different shape, give them a little animation, make something that happens with these different things that really draws your attention to that different thing, then you have achieved that contrast. Right? Now, the big thing here is this next bullet point. Don't be slightly different. Slightly different looks unintentional, which is an issue there. Right? Like we don't want things to look like a mistake. Like if we use like Verdana for one type of font, and then we use Arial for another type of font. Like those are both sans serif fonts. They both look really similar, but like you can tell the difference between them rather easily. But they're so similar that the intention of it isn't there. Right? It doesn't look intentional. It looks like a mistake. It looks like an error. Right? So when we want to make differences, when we want to achieve contrast, we don't just want to make them slight differences. We want to be big differences. Right? Because they're either going to be too slight that people won't notice them and you won't achieve that contrast, or they'll just look unintentional. Right? At the end of the day, intent is a big deal there. Another good thing about contrast is that strong contrast helps visually separate content. Like you might have heard somebody, talking about making the logo bigger. Right? When typically when we're talking about making a logo bigger in a design, a lot of people want their brand to stand out more. Right? So they'll see something and they'll say, oh, well, the logo needs to be bigger. It doesn't stand out as much. But really what's happening there is that we don't have this visual separation. The elements that we're talking about, the contrast, the proximity, the alignment, are all working in such a way where the logo blends in to the background of the site instead of standing out. And calling people's attention. And in some cases, you might want the logo to begin to blend into the background, right? Like I used to do some work for a website, some moderation type work for a website. It was back, we're talking 15, 16 years ago now. and it was a digital media contest site, right? We have Photoshop contests, logo contests, all this sort of stuff. The site doesn't exist anymore. But people would ask the owner of the site, well, why is your logo so plain? Right? The logo was just like a basic font that they had written the name of the site in, really simple logo. And the idea that they communicated back to them was, well, the logo is plain because I kind of want it to blend in, right? I want the content, I want the pictures and the contest imagery to stand out and take focus in the design. So I don't want to put my contrast here in my logo. I want to downplay that contrast in my logo so that the items that are the most contrasty, the images in the contests, take the focus and take the precedence. And when you hear it like that, it makes a ton of sense. Right? It's kind of counterintuitive to a lot of modern wisdom about branding, right? Is to kind of minimize your brand. But in the same sort of way, like it almost makes brand connections between your name and the quality of work that's on your site instead of just your logo. So I think that's smart. And so in doing this, in helping make this visual separation and helping make things pop out, good contrast makes a design more visually appealing just in general. Right? When we have things that look intentional and are different and kind of stand out from one another while still all kind of working together, that's really something that works and something that looks nice. Right? We'll see something to that effect in just a little bit and how we could make that maybe a little better. But contrast is also great for calls to action and next steps, which is why, like, oftentimes you'll see buttons on sites to be a very different color than everything around it, right? Because it's trying to call your attention to that button to get you to initiate an action, right? So, if we have a big green button in the middle of a page, right? Which is actually something that my online class or my design class last year, when we looked at the clevelandcc.edu website, we said we need to have contrast in this site. We need a call to action for us to actually know what we should do here. So if you don't know, right, let me kind of step back a little bit and talk about how the Web 210 design class last year, one of the things that we were tasked with is we were tasked to take the old Cleveland Community College website, which, if you'll remember that from like a year or two ago, it was pretty plain, pretty simple. I might be able to pick it up in archive.org. Let's see if we can. Just so you have a frame of reference, right? Some of you might not remember it. Bear with me just a second here while I pull this up. So you probably remember this website, right? We've got it here through the Wayback Machine, the old Cleveland Community College website. And so when I approach this site, what do I click? Where do I go? What do I do? What's the first thing that I need to do? And it's hard because there's no contrast here. Like, we have this navigation menu here, but which one of these should I do? Which one applies to me? What should we do here? Right? It's hard to tell. And especially, like, for the majority of people who come to the website, one of the initial things that you do before you become a student is you have to apply, right? So that's like the big call to action that we want people to do, is we want them to apply. So with this material here, like, the contrast is low, right? We're not really guiding people through their actions. But now when we come to the new site, the site that we worked on last time, like, we didn't code it, but we definitely workshopped and developed the design. We have this big bright green button right here in the middle of the page that has our call to action, and it's contrasty and it stands out, and we just, in your eyes, immediately just go right there, apply now. So if I'm a new person coming to the site, I don't have any question about where I need to go, what I need to do. Do I want to do this? Do I want to do that? Right? Like, there's a lot of words here. There's a lot of stuff to read. I got to kind of figure it out. Or I could just go here and I could apply now. Boom. And we're in. Right? So we see this example of this contrast here. And it's significant. And we actually have a name for this kind of thing, right? We have a name for this kind of thing from a psychological perspective, where if we take something and we set it apart from other things, it gains more attention. We call this the von Restorff effect, which is also known as the isolation effect. Psychiatrist and pediatrician Hedwig von Restorff, which that's her there in the upper right-hand corner. You see that there. Give her props. Coined this phrase back in 1933 of the isolation effect, or the von Restorff effect. And it's when multiple similar objects are present, the one that's different from the rest is the one that's most likely to be remembered. And let's think about this from another perspective as well, right? Like, think back to when you were a little kid, right? Dr. von Restorff here was a pediatrician, so she probably worked with children a lot. So think back to when you were a little kid and you were presented maybe some options for a candy that you wanted. Right? Maybe you had a row of candies in front of you. Maybe 8 of them were cherry. And one of them was, say, blue raspberry. I don't know. You take personal kind of effect out of that, right? You take, like, personal tastes out of that. Maybe you like both cherry and blue raspberry equally. But you look at this line of candies and you have 7 bright red cherry candies and 1 bright blue raspberry candy. Which one would you want? Which one would you be more likely to, take, right? It's probably going to be the blue raspberry candy because it's the one that stands out. It's the one that sticks up the most. And we also have a condition where the opposite of this becomes true, which I think is also interesting. Right? And this is a really interesting effect that we see, psychologically in the idea of web design and web development. Is this idea of something called banner blindness. Banner blindness. So the idea behind banner blindness in general is that things that look like ads cause us to divert our attention. Because we've been trained, if we see advertising online, right, if we see those little inline ads, we've been trained to ignore them. Right, so let's get ourselves another example here. which one did I want to use? I've forgotten now. But you could think about news sites in general, right? And you'll see some of these news sites, some of which you've probably encountered, that have articles that were paid for, right, that are advertisements, kind of mixed in with articles that are a part of the news site, right? So we're trained to kind of see these ads and dismiss them, move past them, because, we don't want to be advertised to. So when these things look the same, when our news articles look like our ads, people won't read. Like one of the things you might think is, well, that might cause people to, click more on the ads to make us more money. But actually, according to the principle of banner blindness, it's the inverse. People will be less likely to click on your articles, which would also make you money, and less likely to really use your site if your articles look like your ads. And another big psychological property here that kind of plays into this is this idea of information overload. Like if you look at a lot of pages here, right, and I have an example on the next slide here that's a really good example of all of this. So let's just pull it up. All right, we have Sandy's Toys and Shoes here. And we have a low contrast area up top versus a high contrast area down at the bottom. And so what are the important things? Right, well, ideally, Sandy's Toys and Shoes, or Sandy's and Toys Shoes. It's a sample site that somebody built for the purposes of demonstrating low contrast and high contrast. So I'm not entirely... I actually have no idea. Sandy's and Toys Shoes. It's a weird name. But we can see here that the area where you want people to go, the area that you really care about, right, is not this header area where we've got all this stuff, but you want people to go to that featured product. You want people to go buy things from your e-commerce store, right? So you do that. Let's look at some other examples of contrast. And what I've tried to do here is I've tried to just build some material in a very simplified manner. So I stripped out all of the content, or really all of the color here. Right? Anything graphical, anything color-based, anything that's really highly visual, I stripped out of this just so we can see how we can use contrast in other ways here that are different from like color and graphics and all that kind of stuff, right? So this is just a little sample site that was built. And we see a few good examples of contrast here. Like one of the examples that we see is this dark background against our lighter background main area. Now, if we were just trying to push this out as a template, right, this wouldn't be that great. But again, remember that the idea here is that we're just trying to kind of strip out a lot of the extra stuff just so we can see some other ways that we can introduce contrast. So we have this darker background of the page and this lighter foreground color here, usually white. Right, so you get this part that has the content isolated in it, popping right off the page, which is ideal. We also see the difference between our article headline here and our article. And these are web fonts, and in the future we'll actually talk about web fonts and how we use web fonts. It's pretty fun to be able to use different fonts in our site. But we can see the contrast between the headline article, or the headline of the article, and the body text of the article. Right, for the headline we use this big, bold, chunky serif font. For the body, we used this lighter sans serif font. So this is a very clear demarcation, a very clear separation. These two fonts couldn't be any more different from one another. And so we visually separated the headline from the body of the post. Right? And also we see a bit of a difference here between the main story, right, and maybe some secondary or sub stories, right? Like we have these other boxes that have been generated down here. You know, if you want to kind of think of this as like a news site, right, we can think of this section underneath here as like some older stories or maybe some secondary stories that aren't as important as this big headline. Or maybe these are related articles or something like that, right? So we have a contrast in size, we have a contrast in font, we have a contrast in font size, and we have a contrast in brightness, in lightness, right? So even without using like a bright color, we can use contrast in different ways to draw these separations, which is pretty cool. The next thing on our list is repetition. And so whereas with contrast, we want things to be visually different, with repetition, we're kind of going the other way, right? And utilizing both of these things, utilizing very different elements along with very same elements, are both essential to kind of creating this good design. So when we're talking about repetition, we're repeating styles down the page for a cohesive feel. And so by repeating styles, what you're creating is usability. But more importantly here, you're creating trust. And I think that's a very interesting way to put, the use of repetition here, is that you're creating trust. Just kind of think for a minute, imagine in your brain, right, a website that you might go to, and every link on the page is a different color. What would you be expecting? You might have 10 different links on the page. Each different links are, one of 10 different colors. What would you be expecting? You might be expecting, since they're all visually different, for them to do different things. But if they all do the same thing, well, what's really happened there, right? You get confused. You've broken this idea of repetition. Your usability goes down because you're assuming something's going to happen, or maybe something different's going to happen when it's not. And your trust goes down. And this is also one of the issues kind of that I have with certain people in navigations, right? That's why navigation should be consistent across all pages on a site. Because when I travel from one page to the next page, I should expect to have the same navigation. I should expect to be able to interact with this thing in the exact same way. I should expect that to be repeated because you've established this trust. You're trying to establish this trust with me. We're creatures of habit, and if we see home as link 1 on this page and home as link 1 on this page, and then on this third page home is link 4, right, we're probably still going to try to click link 1 because we're used to home being in that first spot. And so we get this cohesion, we get this unity by using repetition, because everything that's the same looks the same. Every secondary article looks the same. Every picture is kind of laid out in a similar manner, right? It's a similar size or in a similar format. We're using consistent colors across the site for our color theme, because those colors apply to different things with different meanings. Right? So really that's what we're talking about when we're talking about repetition, is we're talking about the standardization of elements for the purpose of essentially assigning them meaning. The more you use similar styles and the more you use similar elements, the more comfortable the user feels in how well they understand your design and how well they can interact with your design, even if it's different, even if it doesn't match that whole knowledge in the world stuff that we talked about previously, and they're having to kind of learn your interfaces or learn the way to get around your site because of your design. If you're consistent, if similar things are repeated similarly, then you're going to have a lot easier time teaching your users about how to interact and how to navigate. And then ultimately they become comfortable with your site and using your site. Now, obviously, we also want to incorporate our affordances, signifiers, and feedback into that. So at the same time, while we are, kind of training our users through repetition, they also have our affordances, signifiers, and feedback as prompts and responses that they made the right action and they did the right thing. So this builds on that. This idea. So how can we achieve repetition? Well, essentially we're just repeating design elements to create a consistent feel, right? So if there's some specific element that contains a certain style, we want to use it elsewhere, right? Because those specifically styled elements, we give them meaning. So when they have meaning, we can convey that same meaning in other things by repeating the style. Because in that way, these two items become visually connected. Item A and item B have the same meaning. Why? Or how do we know that? Well, it's because we have similar repeated styles applied to them. So we've made this visual connection. So these visual connections also make the website more user-friendly, right? Because you can establish those meanings. We're reinforcing those meanings and we're establishing those meanings, and they make the website more user-friendly because they can just make assumptions. Right? Instead of having to learn about an entirely brand new thing, they can just make assumptions using context clues regarding similar interfaces they've encountered in the past. Right? And really, that's kind of what we're doing here with repetition, is we're kind of employing a digital visual version of context clues. Right? We see this style. We've encountered this style before in other instances, and in those other instances, this element had this meaning. So now, since we've encountered this style here again via repetition, it must also have that same meaning. Right, so here's a good example of that. It's the old Yeti Coolers website there. And we see 3 products here that we want to highlight and get more information on. And these are our Tundra series, our Roadie series, and our Yeti accessories line. And so we can see like the contrast between these elements that are our repeating elements and the elements on the right-hand side of the page. Right, like we have this big graphic here about how it's grizzly proof, and we can, learn more about how it's grizzly proof. And it looks like we have some video about, maybe it's about how someone can take this cooler fishing and use it while they're fishing. It's kind of what that image or video looks like there. But none of these are really directly related to products. Right, they're related to aspects of products, but not the products themselves. So if we look at our repeating elements here on the left, we see that they are all in some way related to products of some kind, and we see this repetition here, right? All of these little blocks are similar. They have a similar heading style, they have a similar text style, and they have the same button on all of them. So this is establishing a meaning. This is, if I have this element here, this is about one of the products. And if you click this button, it'll give you more information about these products. So we're establishing the semantics here, and we're making a promise to our users. Right? We're making a promise to our users that these similar elements have the same meaning. And you can find similar elements between these, or you can find similar information between these similar elements. Flip my terms around there. By clicking that More Info button to get more info about the product that you're interested in. So it's pretty interesting. And I think the other simple example that we have is a repetition example. Right, so we're kind of building a news site here. And we can see these examples of repetition, and we can see that we're kind of bringing in some of our contrast rules that we had before. And remember that when we're looking at these, what I tried to do here was I tried to strip out like all the graphics, strip out all the color, right, all that other stuff that we're used to normally. So we can see how, how all this works. So, what are our similar things here? Well, the easy thing that we have here is our subarticles. Right? We established those subarticles in the previous site to show the contrast between the main article and the subarticle. And we can see that here more prevalently. Right? Because we've actually titled these things subarticles and we have different aspects to them. But all of our subarticles have a similar feel, right? They all have the same style of heading. They all have the same style of text. The color in these cases aren't important, but they all share a color, right? We just want something that has a little bit of contrast. And they all have a consistent button link on them to where you could click them to read the rest of the article. Right? We also see this headline navigation over here. All of our headlines, all of our links here are the same in this past headline section here. So we'll refer back to this particular example for the rest of our parts of our acronym too. But we can kind of see how, when things are similar, they're grouped together, and when things are different, they're set apart. That should make sense. So the next thing is alignment. Right, or how we line things up together. And when we're talking about alignment, we're talking about lining up the top, bottom, sides, or middle of text or graphical elements on a page. Right, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of centering everything on a page. Especially when you're centering a bunch of paragraphs. I think centering big graphics and stuff like that's fine. Maybe small lines of text like headlines, I think that's fine. But when you see a lot of these pages where they've centered the or they've basically centered everything, where they've centered the paragraphs and everything. Like, alignment is just completely broken. Right? It doesn't seem like there's really a rhyme or reason for things kind of being the way that they are, because they're just kind of flared out, right? Like, we kind of know that, well, it's because this paragraph is center aligned. But I mean, picture in your head the way that the edges look of something that's center aligned like that. You know, they're all jagged. There's no straight line points to where, like, our brains can kind of make this alignment demarcation, right? And that makes everything else kind of difficult on the website. If you wanted to have different sections and things like that, it makes everything else kind of difficult to align on these paragraphs. And so really, when we see alignment and we see how alignment works, this is really the difference between professional design and, well, we'll call it unprofessional design, right? We want things to look intentional. At the end of the day, a lot of this is all about intent. And the more control that we can have over what we're working with, the more intentional that it looks. So when we're achieving alignment, we want to keep in mind that quality alignment is critical to great design. So all page elements should be visually connected to something else. They should be aligned on that page. And so alignment of important content items creates an attractive design, because it's what our eyes are looking for, right? Like, if you've studied many artistic principles, right? You might have heard of something called, like, the rule of thirds, or you might have heard of the golden ratio, or you might have heard of, you know, various things like that. Our brains are kind of wired to view information in a certain way, right? And if we can see things that are in a visual alignment, then it helps kind of our brains to make more sense of this information. We can take this important content, have it all aligned together, and it looks nice. Like, our brains just like the way it looks, in addition to being able to organize the information better. So we use an underlying grid. And in some of the other classes, which I think all of you all are in, we talked about grid, right? And we talked about how we develop a grid using CSS grid. And that's really one of the more modern ways to do a CSS grid. In the old school way, we would do we'd do a grid based on a 960 pixel width, which would be typically 8 to 12 columns wide. Right, for those of you who are in the Web 140 class, we'll talk more about that when we talk about Bootstrap, this old school style 12 column grid. Because that's what Bootstrap uses when we're working with that baked in Bootstrap grid. It's the 12 column. So we want to start with some kind of underlying grid, so we can make this alignment easy. And so we want to left align. What we really want to do is we want to left align, or we want to right align. Center align makes things funky, right? But, you know, in certain occasions, center align can be okay. I even think, you know, it's okay to mix in certain, you know, it says don't mix here, but I think it's okay in certain times. Like, you know, nothing's ever 100% never do this, right? Like, kind of, you know, it's one of those situations where, like, once you learn the rules, you can learn how to break them properly. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we match our spacing, we want to match our margins, our padding, make all that the same. Now, I have this example here, and it's aligned on a grid. And we can see this, you know, it's a hair restoration site. We can see we have a 4-column grid here, and we can see how everything's aligned. Right? Everything from our top navigation to this text in this hero image to our bottom navigation links there are all in the grid lines. Really, the only thing that's out of our grid line here is the logo. Right, and probably if we were to break this down into a 12-column grid instead of a 4-column grid, it would probably be even in the grid lines there. We see a lot of strong alignment here. It almost even looks like they considered the alignment when they were choosing a hero image, right? Because we have the front of this person's face interacting with this grid line here that we've drawn over this image. Right, and we just have this structure just gives us a visually appealing sort of thing. And so if we look at that little example site we've been looking at here, one of the things that we can note is that one of the things that we've tried to do here is we've tried to have consistency in the size of our margins. Right, this one's a little off. Right, this one probably needs to, it needs to be fixed a little bit. Ideally, we'd want this to be a straight line running straight down through here. Right, but we did this a little quickly. But we see these columns are roughly the same size. And there's this alignment here. But really, this gives you a good example of why alignment is so important, right? And how that fit and finish can kind of help elevate a site. Because we've seen a really good example, so why not see a bit of a poorer example here? Because this is slightly off. And it bugs you that it's slightly off. It bugs me that it's slightly off. It's an issue. I want that to be in alignment. I want that to be perfect. Right? Because my animal brain, my lizard brain, wants that to be nice and straight. Right? And that's the way that our users are kind of interacting with their sites. And it doesn't look intentional. Right? It looks like a mistake. And in this case it was, right? Like it looks like a mistake. Because it doesn't look intentional. So that's a big difference there. Finally, and we'll do this one pretty quickly, we have our last piece of our acronym, which is proximity, or the closeness, how we can group things together. So when we're talking about proximity, this is the property of being close together. So things that are close together have a connection with one another. Right? So if we take, for example, a bunch of form elements and we put them together inside of a little box, we've established proximity with all of these form elements for being a part of the same form. So we want to take things that act and look and feel alike, and we want to group them together and make them closer together and apart from other elements that aren't directly related to these particular elements. So when we use proximity in this sort of way, we can kind of connect the like items and separate the site into essentially what can be like digestible chunks. Right? Like there's a term for this called chunking, right? Where we just take the like things and we put them together and we separate them a bit from other sets of like things that are different. Now we have another big psychological thing that goes along with this. There's Miller's law, Dr. Miller there in the upper right hand corner, which is also known as information processing theory. How our users process the information. And so the average person can only keep 7 chunks, plus or minus 2, in their memory at one time. And a chunk can be any meaningful unit, whether they're digits, whether they're words, whether they're faces, whatever, right? Like anything that's meaningful, anything that has a meaning for our users, that's a chunk. So when we utilize proximity and we take like things and we put them in one boundary, we can essentially create bigger chunks. Right? It's kind of like, looking at like a family unit, say. Right? And you have, parents, maybe a father, a mother, maybe a son and a daughter. Right? And on their own, when they're separated, we have these 4 different individuals. Right? The father, the mother, the son, the daughter. Call them by their names. Let's say John, Susan, Mike, and Sarah. Why not? When they're separated, when they're in school and work and they're different places, they're John, Sue, Mike, and Sarah. But if we chunk them, if we put them together, they're the Smiths. Or they're, they're the family that lives there. Right? So we can take this chunking and we can use it to take these different elements that have a similar meaning that we put together, and we can make a bigger chunk out of these smaller chunks of all of this relevant, similar stuff. Which is pretty cool. So as we achieve proximity, essentially what we want to do is we want to understand the fact that proximity creates context, which in turn creates meaning. Right? Like if we think back, like we had all of those subheading articles, all those sub-articles on our site here. They're all in a row there, and they're all kind of contained in that box. And that's really what I was trying to do there when I drew that little green border that you might be able to see, is provide another way that we could potentially chunk these elements by drawing a square around them. So we take items that are alike and we put them together. We take items that are different and we set them apart. The more spacing elements have, the clearer the difference is. Right? So the more distance, the clearer the difference. Because more spacing means less connection. So when we have clear separation, this is kind of what pushes us forward through that, when we're trying to create a path for our user to follow through our website. Right? And we're using our other properties. We're using our contrast. We're using our repetition. We're using our alignment to create this path that we want to kind of guide our user on as we create this environment in which they can have a good experience. We are making these connections stronger or weaker based on relationship. And so when we have this clear navigation, or when we have this clear separation, it makes that path more clear and it makes navigating our websites easier. And so we have this final little example here of proximity. Right? We have this big call to action. Like really, this does a great job at showing us everything that we've discussed today. Right, because our big call to action here about, how Texas Builders Insurance Company is a Texas-based workers' compensation insurance carrier. Do you want to know more? This big call to action here is huge. It's a serif font, where everything else on the page is a sans serif font. So it has a lot of contrast and it stands out. If we look down here if we look in the navigation here, we see our primary navigation. We see how all those links look similar. And we see how there's a box drawn all around them to denote that this is our navigation bar. So we have this idea of proximity and we have this idea of alignment and repetition here. Like we can see alignment as we kind of go down the page here. Things are aligned in a grid here. We can kind of see that. Like if we go straight down from contact us here, Might be a little off. Right, but it's pretty close. And we see this subnav here, where all of these columns, this is a great example of proximity here as well. All of these columns have similar type links in them. And they're separated visually from other columns that have different types of links in them. So we've hit our hour mark, so this is where we'll stop for today. This basically covers all of these concepts in a nutshell anyway. So this covers our C.R.A.P. Now we know our C.R.A.P, right? So I'll hang out in the chat for just a couple more minutes with the music playing, just in case anybody has any questions. But that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.